Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Audrey Lichter, the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Today's Scholars Circle topic is Anti-Semitism, Old and New, Understanding Persistence and Change in Today's World, featuring Dr. Shale Horowitz. Chai Mitzvah is a national organization now celebrating its 16th year. We are the sponsors of Scholars Circle and a Jewish resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement programs. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens and adults, Leah professionally led. For more information, please visit our website at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholars Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea. Scott is our founder and board president, who authored a best-selling book, Conspiracy U, a Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionism conspiracy theories from the left and the right of the political spectrum. You can purchase Scott's book wherever books are sold and on our website. We also have an accompanying curriculum. The curriculum was also taught in a recorded series by Dr. Andrew Pessin. You will receive all this information in our follow-up email as well. The Scholars Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues facing the Jewish community. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. We are excited to continue the Scholars Circle program, and we need your support to keep it thriving. Scholars Circle has engaged nearly 3,000 participants since 10/7. Your donation will enable us to continue bringing international scholars to you at no charge to share their expertise on the evolving Jewish world in the aftermath of October 7th. Please help us reach our goal of $40,000. To make a donation, please visit chaimitzvah.org and click on the gold menu tab Scholars Circle and select Support Scholars Circle. This will be included in our follow-up email as well. Thank you for continuing supporting this engaging program for all. Our featured scholar tonight is Dr. Shale Horowitz, professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research has examined international and ethnic conflict, the politics of international trade and finance, and the politics of market transition and institutional change. He is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 5 books and over 50 academic articles. His current research interests include ethno-territorial wars and Chinese politics. He regularly visits Israel. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&R button on your screen. Q&R will be held at 40 minutes into the lecture, but if you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recorder will be sent to your email in a few days and will also be available at our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Shale Horowitz.
If everybody can see this. Okay, so our topic tonight is anti-Semitism, and particularly by the end, what I hope we'll understand better is today's anti-Semitism, which is an anti-Semitism of the far left and Islamic extremism. What is the nature of that anti-Semitism compared to traditional anti-Semitisms and the tradition of anti-Semitism? So we'll see that it has a lot of things in common with the whole tradition of anti-Semitism going all the way back 2,000 years. But then it has particular characteristics that have to do with adapting anti-Semitism to its own ideological and political needs. So here's our roadmap of how we'll cover this issue. We'll just start out with some definitions and specific information about anti-Semitism. What is it? What's distinctive about it? There's a little early summary of what's distinctive about it, that Jews are viewed as an ideologically cosmic evil. In other words, their evil is cosmic in a sense that it's global or worldwide or universal. And this is part of a larger ideology, this view of Jews. Then we'll talk about the issue a little bit, for starters, from an abstract or theoretical point of view. So what types of factors or causes shape the particular forms that anti-Semitism has taken over time? And then we'll go through a series of historical examples ending up in today's anti-Semitisms. And this will enable us, I think, to better understand today's anti-Semitism. As we said before, it has many elements which are familiar from historical types of anti-Semitism which preceded it. And then it has some characteristics that reflect how anti-Semitism is adapted to its own ideological and political needs. And then we'll briefly talk about how to fight back against it. Okay, so what is anti-Semitism? We're just going to have a simple kind of ordinary language definition here, not one of these technical or legal definitions. So anti-Semitism is a negative, usually hostile, double standard targeting Jewish people. So in other words, Jews are treated or regarded differently from other people. This is in a negative way. And usually there is a hostile agenda behind it. That is, it's not just an attitude, but it's a desire to do something, negative or damaging to the Jewish people. And anti-Semitism may be directed at individual Jews, Jews as a collective group, or the Jewish nation state of Israel. Okay, what is distinctive about anti-Semitism? As we've already mentioned, in comparison with other negative or hostile double standards, the view of Jews is much more deeply negative. They represent a kind of cosmic or universal evil, and they have associated level of power to do evil in the world. And this is usually coupled with an obsessive and disproportionate focus on Jews, hostility toward Jews, and the agenda behind it involves hostile goals and hostile treatment of Jews. Again, more deeply hostile than is the case for other peoples. Just to give you some examples of the forms in which Jews have been regarded as cosmic evils. So a universal type of form has been that Jews are disloyal to the people around them or to the countries they live in or the empires they live in, that they are agents of ideological and cultural subversion of the dominant culture. If we go back further in time, older forms of cosmic evil are more religious in character. So deicide, Jews are the killers, or Jews killed Jesus, right? The Son of God, or Jews have made war on God's prophets. That's the traditional Islamic point of view, including Muhammad, and ceremonial blood libels associated with the practices of Jews. Even though we associate those with the Middle Ages, they actually go back to 2,000 years. In the more modern period, some examples of forms of evil are associated with anti-capitalism. For example, Jews are exploitative or decadent, and leftist evils. Jews are racists, Nazis, guilty of apartheid, colonialism, and genocide. Okay, now looking at anti-Semitism from a more abstract point of view, what forces shape anti-Semitism and can also explain why it takes different forms at different times. So we'll just quickly go through three types of factors that have an influence. One is characteristics of the Jewish people at various points in time and over time. Another is characteristics of anti-Semites, especially the most influential anti-Semites and the most influential anti-Semitic movements or worldviews. And then finally, just situational conditions. So some characteristics of the Jewish people that are relevant. Obviously, Jews are a distinct ethnic group. They are a nation in the technical social science sense. That means a group that aspires to self-determination on a homeland territory. Okay, so of course, Jews are not just an ethnic group, but they view themselves as a people that should have ideally self-determination in the land of Israel. The second point there, Jews are monotheistic and distinctively rule-bound. This is a complex one. Okay, so Of course, Jews are the first to map out in a very elaborate way the characteristics of the monotheistic God. So Jews have a relationship with a universal deity that has all of the characteristics that a universal deity should have. In other words, a, a kind of perfect relationship with the world and a correct relationship with all people in terms of the kinds of life they should live and the way they should live. So there is that universal characteristic of Jewish identity. And yet at the same time, coupled with that, there is a particular identity, right? Jews have their particular covenant with God, which gives them this self-determination or existence on their homeland territory in exchange for them upholding their responsibilities to God, which are a distinctive set of laws and rules that they must live by in order to uphold their responsibility to God. So this is an unusual combination. In other words, the Jewish identity is a universal one. Its legitimacy is universal and associated with a monotheistic God, which gives legitimacy to all other forms of life. And yet at the same time, it must remain separate in a distinctive way based upon a particular covenant or relationship with God. Now, this Jewish identity also is at the root, amazingly, of almost all major universal ideologies. Okay, so first of all, at the root of Christianity and Islam, we're all familiar with that, but also at the root of modern secular ideologies, the most important modern secular ideologies. So Jewish nationalism, the relationship of the Jews as a people with their land, is the earliest form probably of something that looks very much like modern nationalism. So it's a kind of model for modern nationalism, which arguably is the most influential ideology in the modern world. Its ethical and legal worldview obviously is at the root not only of Christianity and Islam, but also of leftist, universalist, utopian ideologies like socialism and communism. So all of these ideologies have this relationship to Judaism, and it's a problematic relationship. That's something that we're going to come back to. Jews are relatively small in numbers at most points in time that we're concerned with as compared with their enemies. And of course, they have lived in the diaspora for something like 2 millennia. This diaspora existence is an unusual one. Jews live separately from other peoples, generally speaking. They have a different way of life, and they are scattered in small groups all over the place. At the same time, they are often prominent. Even during periods when they were discriminated against historically, they were often concentrated in fields like trade and finance that were very visible to others and often resented. And during periods when they were treated more equally, they have achieved prominence in many fields, of course. So again, they are very visible in the modern world. Okay, some characteristics of anti-Semites now. So this is a very strong pattern. The more supremacist or exclusivist the ideology is, the more intense is its hostility to Jews, the more Jews are singled out as a particular enemy. So supremacist means the more the ambition of the ideology is to replace all other ideologies and to be the final ideology for all of humanity. And the more that it applies to all, the more Jews tend to be targeted. And this hostility is intensified for ideologies that have this kind of ideological relationship with Jews that we just talked about. So Christianity and Islam, as well as modern secular ideologies like nationalism and communism and socialism. Jews, because they stand out, more obviously reject these would-be dominant ideologies. So Jews stand out and they refuse to conform. These various ideologies, especially the more universalist ones, they tend to project the characteristics onto Jews of the most distinctive forms of evil in their worldviews. And we'll see many examples of that. But for example, let's say far leftists associate Jews with capitalism, let's say, or with the most powerful capitalist country, the United States. But we'll see many examples of this pattern. Okay, so Jews get kind of parachuted into this role of an exemplar or a tool of the greatest evil in these various ideological worldviews. And as it says there on the bottom, sometimes they're thought of as a tool or an instrument of that cosmic enemy, and sometimes they're thought of as the controller, actually, of that cosmic enemy, and sometimes both. Okay, situational conditions that influence anti-Semitism. The one on the top we're all familiar with. So Jews are a convenient scapegoat. They're a relatively small and distinctive enemy. So you're not picking a costly fight. You're not attacking those that have very powerful allies. Anti-Semitism often allows you to form alliances with other organized groups for which Jews are also a convenient scapegoat. Jews are often a source of a material plunder, of course. And also, the form of anti-Semitism is just influenced, of course, by changing historical conditions, changing political situations, changing ideological trends, and sometimes even things like technological innovations, like new mass media or new media like social media. Okay, so now we're going to go through a few examples. We'll start out with some older versions of anti-Semitism and come up to modern ones. And you'll start to see common patterns here as we run through these examples. Okay, so the first really prominent, you could say, global form of anti-Semitism was something which developed in the Greco-Roman tradition, that is both within Greek and Roman culture. So Jews clung to their covenant with God and their local identity. They refused to kowtow to these imperial rulers or to assimilate to their ways of life. Jews famously revolted against the Seleucid Greek empire in the Syria, land of Israel region. That was one of the imperial descendants of Alexander's empire. That was successful, of course. That was the Maccabean Revolt, which restored Jewish independence in the land of Israel for some hundreds of years. And then there were the two famous revolts against the Romans, both of which failed in very bloody, horrific fashion. And if you compare this anti-Semitism from the Greek and Roman tradition, most scholars view this as less intense than the later forms of anti-Semitism. And the usual explanation for why that is that this was not an ideologically grounded hostility in the same way as the later forms of anti-Semitism. It was based more on a Greek and Roman sense of superiority in terms of their military and political power, and from their point of view, the superiority of their culture. So here's a great line from the Emperor Caligula to illustrate this attitude toward Jews. So he says, quote, "So you are the enemies of the gods, the only people who refuse to recognize my divinity," unquote. So you think you're better than everyone else, and in particular, my claim to superiority. You don't recognize that, and that angers me because I'm the emperor, I'm the equivalent of some kind of godlike authority to which you owe absolute obedience. Okay, of course, the next important historical form of anti-Semitism was Christian anti-Semitism. Here I'm going to talk about pre-modern Christian anti-Semitism. So there were a number of different motives for this. The most immediate motive, of course, was to separate the early Christian communities from the bloody Jewish revolts against Rome and the Roman repression of the Jewish people. So obviously the early Christians, in addition to their religious differences from Jews, they did not want to get involved in this conflict with Rome, and they wanted a more universal identity, which eventually allowed them, after significant success in spreading within the Roman Empire, to be adopted as the state religion of the Roman Empire, of course, first by the Emperor Constantine. And this development gave Christian leaders great political power in addition to their ideological influence. And so that led to also new forms of Christian anti-Semitism. So in ideological terms, Jews were viewed as a type of rival. So by discrediting Jews, you could prevent them from turning into a significant ideological rival. That may be difficult to understand after the early period, but Judaism had a lot of resemblance to very powerful Christian heresies during the early centuries of Christianity. Some of those heresies were more strictly monotheistic, like Judaism. So this continued to be an ideological issue for Christian leaders. So of course, the most damaging form of Christian anti-Semitism was the tendency to blame Jews as a group for the crucifixion of Jesus. So obviously, the killers of the Son of God represent a significant form of evil. Just to give you an example of this, an important example of this. So Augustine, probably the most influential Christian leader of his age, he compared Jews collectively to Cain in the book of Genesis. Okay, Cain who killed his brother and was condemned by God to perpetual exile. Just some more details about Christian anti-Semitism over time. Okay, so once Christianity acquired a political power and influence, this led to legal discrimination against Jews in the Roman Empire and in its successor states in the various forms that we're familiar with. It led to significant massacres, like in the First Crusade. Another example of ideological anti-Semitism is the Antichrist myth in Christian ideology or in Christian worldviews. Often the Antichrist was understood to be in alliance with Jews to destroy Christianity. The blood libels, which started in England in the 12th century and then developed across Europe at various points in time. I mentioned earlier, actually, though, that this is over 1,000 years older in its earlier forms. There were various expulsions of Jews from major countries. In the modern period, Christian anti-Semitism often viewed Jews negatively. This was mainly in the 19th and early 20th centuries because of their association from the point of view of many influential Christians with influential modern trends that were perceived as a threat to Christianity, such as secularism, a cultural decadence, capitalism, and far-left ideologies. Okay, Islamic anti-Semitism. Of course, Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was deeply influenced by Judaism, but the Jews refused to convert to Islam. And the early periods, the formative periods of Islam during Muhammad's life, involved significant conflicts with Jews, in which Jews were defeated, expelled, killed, and enslaved. Those incidents are very influential in the Islamic worldview. There are also anti-Semitic stereotypes in the Quran and in the Sunnah, that is the life and sayings of Muhammad, where Jews are regarded as treacherous, cowardly, and fomenters of war or conflict. Again, there's an ideological rivalry here. So the Islamic worldview traditionally has been that Jews rejected God's prophets, including Muhammad. And the claim typically is that actually these prophets, going all the way back to Moses, were actually Islamic prophets, and that Jews falsified their teachings and betrayed their teachings. So because of this rejection by the Jews of God's prophets, similarly to Christians, they are rejected by God in favor of Muslims. Okay, other characteristics of a pre-modern Islamic anti-Semitism. So non-Muslim monotheists had this type of second-class status called dhimmi status. This involved various forms of legal discrimination at different points in time, depending upon the political arrangement in different parts of the Islamic world. There is a long history of pogroms, mass killings, and forced conversions, which have occurred throughout Islamic history all the way up through the modern period. These persecutions generally did not reach the scale of those that sometimes occurred in Europe, and probably the main reason for that is that Jews were not as distinctive or prominent within the pre-modern Islamic world as they were within the pre-modern Christian world. I should just point out here as a last point that we should not assume that dominant religious worldviews or civilizations are intolerant of other religions, and that's somehow natural. It's not, okay? So if we look at broader global history, we can see many examples of empires and civilizations, including those that had preferred religions or religious worldviews, which were tolerant of other religious points of view. Okay, now coming up to the modern period, so let's just start out with far-right anti-Semitism. So usually this is associated with nationalism of various kinds and often influenced by other right-oriented types of anti-Semitism. So Jews are often considered to be disloyal, having excessive influence, again, cultural decadence, and association with extreme left ideologies. The most famous example of this, of course, is the forgery of the Tsarist secret police, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, in which Jews secretly conduct a worldwide conspiracy against various rivals and enemies and do various kinds of evil in the world. Then there's the Nazi type of far-right anti-Semitism, which has more racial characteristic, which we'll talk about more in the next slide. Now, this far-right anti-Semitism was badly discredited by the Holocaust, of course, and the other things done by the Nazis, and has been less influential in the Western world since World War II, as compared with before World War II. Okay, just to briefly, review, you're all familiar, I think, with the characteristics of Nazi anti-Semitism, but what was distinctive is the melding of traditional forms of anti-Semitism with pseudoscientific racial theories. So Jews were associated with all the modern evils that the Nazis viewed as primary enemies, such as communism, capitalism, and a moral decadence. But these evils were not just cultural, they were also inherently racial. So they're just part of the racial or ethnic characteristics of Jews, not just their culture or their religion. And again, Jews were elevated in the Nazi worldview to a cosmic leadership role, right? So there's Jewish capitalism, Jewish Bolshevism. So as weird as that seems, this relatively small people was elevated to this weird leadership role, which was somehow not just cultural, but genetic. And the racial element is often viewed as directly related to the plan of annihilation that is going beyond previous forms of anti-Semitism, which typically involved discrimination, forced expulsion, sometimes pogroms and mass killings, to this plan for total annihilation. Okay, coming to modern leftist forms of anti-Semitism. So Marxist anti-Semitism was not racial, but mainly saw Jews as associated in various ways with capitalism, a symptom of capitalism, and as a leading driver of capitalist evils. Here's a quote from Karl Marx, who of course is of Jewish ancestry, even though he didn't grow up Jewish. The emancipation of Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. So he views Judaism as a kind of pure evil. In other words, there's nothing redemptive, or there's nothing of any value in Judaism, it's just going to fade away along with other evils which are responsible for repression in the world. So there's a kind of really deep hostility there, despite the fact that there's no racial element. Lenin actually, toward Jews, one of the more enlightened of the Soviet leaders. Unlike other peoples in the former Soviet Union, he refused to accept that Jews were a nation. So Jews were just a scattered ethnic group from his point of view that were consigned to much more immediate assimilation. In other words, there was no Soviet recognition of cultural identity or national identity for Jews. And the result of that was that the Soviet system was much more dangerous for Jews in terms of retaining their identity, because it decisively targeted religious institutions and observance, which was the main source of continuing separate Jewish identity. Anti-Semitism took a very intense turn under Stalin. This is often associated with Stalin's turn toward Russian nationalism during World War II, but continuing after World War II. So Jews were branded as rootless cosmopolitans and parasites. After the formation of the State of Israel, they were branded as being disloyal because of their sympathies for Israel. So there is a typical kind of contradiction in Judaism. So Jews are both rootless cosmopolitans and they're also nationalists, but didn't stop them from holding those inconsistent ideas in their head at the same time. Famously, under Stalin, just before he died, the Soviet Union announced a doctor's plot, a plot of Jewish doctors designed to kill Soviet leaders in a conspiracy with the United States. There was a plan. Not only were Jews were purged when this was announced, and even before it, but after it was announced, purged on a large scale from prominent positions, and then mass deportations to labor camps and to Siberia were planned. And fortunately, Stalin died before this plan could be implemented. From the mid-1950s, and then this intensified in later decades, the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, this Soviet anti-Semitism went international based upon an alliance between the Soviet Union with its ideologically akin pan-Arab socialist nationalist regimes, led by Nasser's Egypt and other examples. So the Soviet Union continued to scapegoat Jews domestically within the Soviet Union, but now combined that with an international crusade against Israel. This should all look familiar to you from the last year and a half. Israel was condemned as Nazi, racist, colonialist, apartheid, genocidal. And here's a line from the Soviet leader Brezhnev: in their atrocities, it seems they, the Israelis, want to copy the crimes of the Hitler invaders. Okay, so no limit to the perfidy and evil of the Jews and of Israel. Again, remarkably echoing the protocols of Zion, Jews were elevated to this global role in alliance with capitalism and the United States and their alleged imperialism. And this was tied all the way back to the covenant in the Bible. And even Tsarist pogroms were legitimized as understandable based upon the exploitation conducted by Jews. Okay, now this Soviet anti-Semitism has been absorbed and adopted in a straight line, almost literally word for word, by today's far left. And we can see this across leftist politics in democracies, unfortunately. So the left is much more hostile to Israel than the right, and the farther left you go, the more reliably hostile are these parties, movements, and governments to Israel. The United States was an exception to this rule until recent decades, but beginning with Jimmy Carter and other leaders, we've had a gradual I guess you could say now, takeover of the Democratic Party, which has proceeded quite far. And it's remarkable just to point out that apart from its own self-hatred for Western traditions, I'm talking now about the far left, there's really no other entity on Earth which is openly hated and targeted for annihilation in the way that Israel is. That's pretty remarkable. So, it's worthwhile sitting back and thinking about that. Israel is the greatest evil in the world for this global ideological movement. Okay, let's talk about modern, briefly, Islamic anti-Semitism. So it combines elements of traditional anti-Semitism with modern imports from Europe and the West, both far right and far left influences. So this takes various forms. Of course, it's very galling that little Israel could defeat the Arab world and could defeat the Islamic world and survive and thrive. That's very difficult to follow. Jews are also, again, associated with the greater evils that the Islamic extremist movement perceives as threatening Islam. So they're perceived as associated with modernity, cultural decadence, far left ideologies, capitalism, and the United States. And again, Jews are viewed as controllers and tools at the same time of all of these larger global evils. But Jews play a kind of a vanguard role, an important role. And this anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is much more omnipresent and influential in the Islamic world than it is in other parts of the world, largely because of state patronage for many decades. So this is a part of state propaganda across much of the Islamic world. Okay, just the example of Hamas, we can see melding of traditional and modern forms of anti-Semitism. So Jews are responsible for fomenting wars and conflict everywhere. That's a more traditional one. A more modern one, Jews are controlling the mass media and international finance. Okay, so now to kind of summarize the characteristics of the most influential modern forms of anti-Semitism. So we see this in two influential global supremacist ideological movements. Okay, so that of the secular far left and that of Islamic extremism. So both of these movements are supremacist movements that ultimately seek to control the whole world and impose their way of life on the whole world. They are the fiercest anti-Semites in the world for the kinds of reasons that we've been looking at. Jews very visibly refuse to submit to their orthodoxy, refuse to accept their ideological worldview, claim an equally valid way of life and worldview based upon the same universal principles that these ideologies claim to uphold. And also, Jews are useful scapegoats, right? They are few, they are scattered. So it is useful to adopt them as an object of hate and use that to recruit supporters and allies. And again, both of them associate Jews with their greater enemies in their cosmic worldviews. So therefore, Jews become elevated to the same status in terms of their power and evil as their primary enemies. The movement to destroy Israel is just the most recent version of this broader anti-Semitic worldview that these ideologies have adopted. Remarkably, they share the same two specific cosmic enemies, America as the leader of the traditional West and Israel. And again, in some versions, America controls Israel, and in other versions, Israel controls America. So how do we fight back against this ideological war that we face? So we again have to play defense and offense. Both of these things are necessary. We have to refute the lies and the slanders about Israel and about Jews. Let me say here that we cannot restrict our defense to Jews, defending the position of Jews, because the strategy of our enemies, the primary strategy now, is to demonize Israel first, and once that is accomplished, to demonize Jews by association. So if they are successful in demonizing Israel, then Jews will not be safe. So it is unavoidable not just to defend Jews, but also to defend Israel if we want Jews, not just Israel, but if we want Jews also to be safe in the modern world. So another thing that we need to do, in addition to defending Israel and the Jews, is to call out this anti-Semitism of the Islamic extremists and the far left, to identify it in the ways that we've talked about, and to criticize and attack them for their goals and methods, which involve eliminating Israel and forcibly assimilating the Jews by whatever means are necessary. A third thing we need to do in counterattacking is to attack their particular ideologies and point out how their ideologies threaten the whole rest of the world in order to build the broadest possible defensive coalition against them. So if Jews in Israel are not safe, if they succeed against Jews in Israel, then everyone else is next, target by target. And so their other enemies have an incentive to support Jews in Israel. And the opposite is also true. Jews and Israelis in Israel must also support their enemies, because their enemies' fight is also our fight. If their enemies are destroyed, then we're next also. That doesn't mean being indiscriminate or dropping our standards, but it means supporting legitimate, like-minded targets or those that are threatened by our common enemies. Again, this is just identifying some particularly shocking characteristics of today's anti-Semitism. So this uniquely intense hatred, the far-reaching, punitive, lethal goals and methods which target not just Israel, but Jews, despite the fact that Israel is among the most moderate states in its goals and methods of all peoples involved in similar conflicts. So it is shocking to compare the global reactions to October 7th and September 11th. That gives you a sense of the depth and lethality of hostility to Israel and Jews. Israel is the world's Jew. Okay, that is the world's treatment of Israel, has all the hallmarks of traditional anti-Semitic attitudes and treatment of Jews. Israel too refuses to submit ideologically. Israel and Jews are at the origin in their worldviews, their understandings of these modern ideologies. Israel is viewed as associated with their cosmic evils in their broader ideologies, and Israel is easily scapegoated for the reasons that we talk about, is a convenient scapegoat. So just to conclude the presentation, and then we'll take questions. This is my standard slide here for the end of Chai Mitzvah talks and Q&A. Don't be intimidated by these extremists. Stand up, refute what they have to say. That's the defense, and counterattack. Attack their ideologies and their agendas. They're the ones who are a threat to the world, not us and not other moderates in the world. To do this, we have to educate ourselves and others. This is an ongoing process, right? Everything changes, and the way that this needs to be done constantly changes. So we all have to stay on our toes, and we can all do this in ways that suit us. by supporting the many outstanding organizations which are involved in this fight, including Chai Mitzvah. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and let's hopefully have some good questions.
Okay, thank you, Shale. So Dr. Horowitz, again, a very comprehensive and sweeping history of anti-Semitism. There's quite a number of questions. I want to just reiterate that you're talking about far left and far right, because there are some questions about just general left and right people. You're really not talking about that. You're talking about on the far left and the far right, because there are some questions relating to the accusation that all people on the left are anti-Semites, and that's not what you said. So I just want to clarify that before we go on. So there's a question here about from an anonymous about why the current phenomena of anti-Semitism among Jews, that the LGBT community and left-leaning activists. So what is that about? That the Jews themselves, their Jews themselves seem to have accepted some of the anti-Semitic tropes that you're talking about in terms of other communities.
Okay, so let me just repeat the question as I understand it. So the question is about why Jews in certain ideological communities have adopted the worldview of anti-Semitism. So there's nothing new about this. Okay, so we can go back to examples like Karl Marx, of course, Leon Trotsky, in our own day, Noam Chomsky, right? There are many examples of this. So it's very common when people convert to another worldview for them to adopt the ideology of the new worldview very intensely. So Jews that adopt the worldview, let's say, of the modern far left, they're likely to adopt its whole worldview about Jews in Israel of the kind that we just talked about. So, and they're often likely to adopt it more intensively because they're converts and they're trying to show their loyalty to their new community.
Okay. So here's a question about could you address the right-wing Christian nationalism? Do you see that as being a threat? You talked about the white supremacists, but they're Christian. The Christian far right has been very supportive of Israel I think. But can you address that as in terms of right-wing anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so of course there is right-wing anti-Semitism of the far right. We can call that maybe neo-Nazi or white supremacist, let's say, anti-Semitism. I don't believe that that is a threat in terms of its scale and power that is comparable to radical Islam and far left anti-Semitism. It exists, but it's much more culturally and politically marginal, fortunately. That doesn't mean it can't grow, so we shouldn't ignore that, but it is not a primary threat, in my view, in the way that Islamic extremism and radical left anti-Semitism are. As you said, if we look at more moderate Christian worldviews, it's pretty much a mixture of everything that we see in center right and center left politics around the world. So, for example, as we know, the Pope is not very friendly to Israel. On the other hand, many traditional Catholics are. Probably traditional Catholics are more philo-Semitic on average than if we take the population as a whole, although that would vary obviously by country and time period. But I mean, I'm talking about in recent times. And then, of course, evangelical Christians especially in the United States, but even globally, are much more friendly to the United States. That includes Latin America. Okay, so for example, many people aren't aware of it, but evangelical Christianity may exceed Catholicism before too long in its scope and influence in Latin America. And that evangelical tradition in Latin America tends to be philo-Semitic.
Mhm. I actually learned about Kufi, Christians United for Israel, Pastor Hagee, and his work giving millions and millions and millions of dollars to Israel. I was there in Houston. Was it? No, it was not Houston. It was San Antonio, maybe, where the Cornerstone Church is. It's quite amazing organization. There's a couple of questions about the blood libel. I don't know if you're equipped to really tell us about the history of the blood libel. Dr. Bloom actually asked, what's the origin of this? It seems as though, I'll read you her question, actually. Could you please unpack the origins of the blood libel given Jewish dietary aversion to blood? Both because the ancient Amalekites used blood sacrifices and kashrut seeks to eliminate blood from the meat. It seems since Christians ate the body of Christ and drank blood of Christ, this was a more projection, but I don't know the origins. And so somebody's asking also, where did it come from?
I don't have a really deep knowledge of this question, but I'll just mention that the earliest form of a blood libel that I'm aware of was in Hellenistic Alexandria in the first century of the Common Era, right? So roughly 2,000 years ago, where Jews were accused of conducting human sacrifices, and there were pogroms against Jews. So without getting into the details of where this originates in particular historical manifestations, the broader point, which is clearer, is just that if you view a people as a cosmic evil, as a great evil in some sense, then you are on the lookout for evidence of that great evil. And so that leads to either fabrication or false perceptions about what Jews are doing. And I'm going to read you another quote here of this, which is kind of amazing. This is a Saint Jerome, which I think is from the 5th century. He speaking about the synagogue. He says, if you call it a brothel, a den of vice, the devil's refuge, Satan's fortress, a place to deprave the soul, you are still saying less than it deserves.
Mm.
So this was an extremely learned man, a titan of the early Christian church, but yet able to fabricate these absurd lies and slanders. So to me, that's the takeaway rather than where the blood libel particularly emerges from. In other words, I'll connect this right to the charge of a genocide in the Gaza war. Okay, this is obviously not a genocide. If anything, it's the opposite, right? There's no example of an army facing an enemy which is so interpenetrated in a civilian population that has made greater efforts to spare that civilian population. Nevertheless, this is repeated over and over again, and many, many people and movements want to believe it, and so they will repeat it over and over and over again, and people will believe it.
Yes, there are quite a number of questions about the current state of the university. Where is that coming from? That the academic world seems to be fully behind the anti-Israel agenda. Are there suggestions about how to address this on the university campus?
Okay, the first question is easier to deal with, right, where it comes from. It's obviously correlated with the march of the far left into humanities and social science departments to the point where they account for larger and larger shares of the faculty. So they tend to have the broader far left worldview, right? They're devotees of people like Karl Marx and Noam Chomsky. And so they have the same kinds of attitudes toward Jews and Israel. And just to give you some personal examples, I see this kind of thing all the time, just in passing. People that are teaching courses, professors that are teaching courses that have nothing to do with Judaism or Israel, and they will parachute in readings or books which are viciously anti-Israel, or in many cases also viciously anti-Jewish because of the association of Jews with Israel. And another thing that I see is I think the only two things that it's okay to hate among students are America and Israel. I've never seen any other entities, not to say that they aren't hated quietly, but it's okay to public and loudly hate America and Jews and Israel. Jews because of their association with Israel, insofar as they are Zionists supporting Israel. What do we do about this? That's a very hard one because these people are entrenched and they're not going anywhere. And so it's a struggle that those of us that are in a position to are going to have to um, conduct in various ways. But I would say that the university is not going to be the place where there are the biggest returns to investment against anti-Semitism or anti-Israel attitudes. Probably we're better off focusing on things like social media or other institutions that are more open to our point of view. That's not to say we should give up the fight in universities, but the universities are a place where anti-Semites hold the high ground.
So we're heading into the holiday of Passover. And there's a phrase in the Haggadah that says, in every generation, there will be people that will rise up against us. And your talk seems to corroborate that. There's a movie that's being shown called Tragic Awakenings. And its thesis is that we're hated because of who we are, because of the values that the Jewish people fundamentally hold. And that this is something that the best way to combat anti-Semitism is to be more Jewish. I'm wondering if you could kind of wrap up your talk with relating it somehow to the experience of the Passover Seder and what we're about to engage in the next couple of in a few days.
Yeah, so the way I would do that would be, one of the commandments is to tell the story of the Seder to your children and to make sure that your children know about this part and all the parts of, the covenantal relationship between God and the Jewish people, right? That's one of the things which is at the core of Judaism. That's one, and the other is the laws and the way of life. So, and those two things are interpenetrated, of course. So we have to go back to these basic traditions and appreciate them. And I think in many ways, Judaism and Israel are very consistent with the modern world. In other words, what I talked about before, universal yet particular, right? That means that we coexist, but we're not relativistic. We still aspire to uphold the same standards as everyone else, and we expect others to uphold those standards toward us. So I think that although Judaism was very difficult in a world where there was one dominant worldview and one dominant way to live, in a modern pluralistic world, it's much easier and much more viable and more easily defensible. So I think that we have a beautiful story to tell the rest of the world, and we shouldn't be ashamed about it. And we shouldn't be afraid of fighting back against our enemies and telling the world who they are and what they're like.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for all the questions. And thank you, Dr. Horowitz, again. Um, uh, our next Scholar Circle features Dr. Eli Saltzman. The topic will be From Jerusalem to Washington, the Dynamics of Israel-U.S. Relations on Tuesday, April 22nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So we'll hope to see you then. And in the meantime, a Chag Sameach to everyone. And thank you, Dr. Horowitz, again. There are many, many more questions. And I'm sure that in the follow-up email, you'll have a link to be able to email to Dr. Horowitz if you have more questions for him. I'm sure he's willing to engage this topic as it's quite interesting and depressing topic. Okay, very good. Thank you all, and thank you all for attending tonight, and we'll see you on April 22nd, 7 p.m. As we discuss From Jerusalem to Washington, the dynamics of Israel-U.S. relations. Good night, everyone, and Chag Sameach.